There is a pattern that plays out in almost every dynamic with an avoidant that most people do not recognize until they have lived through it enough times to see its shape clearly. The pattern is not complicated. It does not require sophisticated psychological analysis to identify once you know what to look for. But it is so deeply embedded in the ordinary texture of how these dynamics run that it can feel, from inside it, less like a pattern and more like simply the way things are. Like the natural, inevitable, unavoidable character of loving someone who is wired for distance. The avoidant runs hot and cold. They get close and then they retreat. They offer warmth and then they manage it back to a comfortable level. They say things that suggest depth and then behave in ways that contradict the suggestion. And you respond. You respond to each move they make with the honest, human, entirely understandable reaction of someone who is paying attention and trying to navigate the dynamic thoughtfully. You pursue when they retreat. You soften when they go cold. You reassure when the warmth gets managed down. You work consistently and with genuine effort to close the gap that the avoidant keeps recreating. And the working closes nothing permanently, because the working is what keeps the game running. Your responsive engagement with every move is the oxygen the pattern requires to keep burning. And the thing that stops it, the single specific genuine thing that causes the avoidant to finally stop playing games and engage with the actual reality of the relationship, rather than with the managed, distanced, defended version of it, is not that a response to any particular move. It is the removal of the oxygen entirely, not as a tactic, as the genuine, self-directed, honest expression of someone who has understood what the game requires and has decided they are no longer available to provide it. Before going into what this actually looks like and why it works, something needs to be established honestly. The framing of avoidance playing games requires careful handling, because the word games implies deliberate, conscious, strategically deployed behavior designed to manipulate. And while some of what avoidants do in relationships does produce the effects of game playing, the intermittent reinforcement, the hot and cold cycling, the push and pull that keeps the other person perpetually activated and off balance, most of it is not deliberately strategic. Most of it is the automatic, below-conscious, fear-driven operation of an attachment system that learned to manage closeness through distance and is running that programming without full awareness of what it is producing. This distinction matters for two reasons. First, because understanding the behavior accurately is more useful than mischaracterizing it. Second, because the response that actually stops the pattern is different depending on whether the pattern is deliberate or automatic. Deliberate games require strategic countermoves. Automatic patterns require something different. They require the removal of the conditions that allow the pattern to continue running. And the removal of those conditions is not a counter-strategy. It is a genuine change in how you are showing up. A genuine change in what you are and are not available for. That genuine change is what this conversation is about. Not the tactic of appearing unavailable in order to produce a reaction. The real, honest, self-respecting, deeply personal shift that removes the conditions the pattern requires. The first thing you need to understand is why the pattern runs at all. What it requires. What conditions make it possible for the avoidant to continue the cycling of closeness and distance without the cycling producing a genuine confrontation with its own costs? The pattern requires your predictability. Specifically, it requires the predictability of your emotional investment in the dynamic's continuation. The pattern runs on the background knowledge, not always consciously held, but functionally operational, that you will continue to be available. That your investment in the connection is consistent enough and significant enough that each withdrawal will be followed by your re-engagement. That the floor will hold, that the door you closed will eventually reopen, that the space between you will be closed by you rather than by them. Your predictable investment is the structural foundation on which the avoidance pattern of managed distance operates. Without that predictability, without the reliable background knowledge that your investment will continue regardless of the pattern's operation, the pattern loses its structural foundation. It cannot run on the same terms. It has to engage with a different set of conditions. Conditions in which the outcome is genuinely uncertain. In which the continuation of the connection is not guaranteed by your investment alone. In which the avoidance contribution to the dynamic survival is actually required for the dynamic to survive. That shift in conditions, from your predictable investment providing the structural foundation to genuine mutuality being required for the connection to continue, is the shift that stops the pattern. Not because the avoidance suddenly transforms, because the pattern cannot run in the new conditions, The conditions that the pattern requires no longer exist. What does it actually mean to remove your predictable investment? What does this look like in practice? Because the answer to this question is where most guidance on this topic goes wrong. Most guidance frames the removal as a technique, as something you do to produce a specific effect in the avoidant. As a strategy deployed with one eye on how the avoidant will respond, that framing undermines the very thing that makes the removal effective. The removal is not effective because it is a clever response to the pattern. It is effective because it is genuine, because it reflects a real change in your relationship to the dynamic, rather than a performed change designed to produce a specific outcome. The genuine removal looks like this. You stop treating the dynamic as the primary variable of your emotional life, not strategically. Because you have honestly, through the process of everything this arc of experience has produced, arrived at a place where your own life, your own genuine interests, your own developing inner world, your own relationships and projects, and the specific real texture of your daily existence has reclaimed the bandwidth that the monitoring of the dynamic was consuming. The dynamic becomes one thing in a life that has other things in it, not the thing around which other things are arranged. You stop filling the silences, not as a test of whether the avoidant will fill them, because the silences no longer feel, to you, like gaps requiring your intervention. Because your sense of the dynamic's health is no longer entirely dependent on the maintenance of contact. Because you have enough of your own interior life happening that the silence is simply the silence rather than the threatening, anxiety-producing, must-be-addressed absence that it previously was. You stop interpreting every signal, not because you become less perceptive, because you redirect the perceptual energy toward your own experience rather than toward the decoding of theirs. The avoidance behavior is no longer the primary text you are reading. Your own genuine experience of the dynamic, whether it is nourishing or depleting, whether it is meeting your actual needs or not, becomes the primary text. These shifts are not techniques. They are the natural outcomes of genuine self-reclamation, of the process that the whole arc of this experience has been building. The self-knowledge, the restored perceptual confidence, the accurate baseline for what adequate love looks like. The detachment that came from genuinely choosing your own life over the monitoring of someone else's patterns. When these shifts are genuine, when they are lived rather than performed, the avoidant encounters something in the dynamic that their pattern has no adequate response to. They encounter a person who is no longer playing. Not because that person decided to stop playing as a tactical move, because that person genuinely stopped being available for the specific configuration the pattern requires. Because the predictable investment that the pattern's structural foundation depended on is no longer reliably present. Because the other person in the dynamic has become honestly and without performance someone who is there if the dynamic becomes genuinely mutual and worth being there for, and not there if it does not. What happens in the avoidant when they encounter this genuine shift? When the person they have been relating to, whose predictable investment was the reliable background of the dynamic, is no longer operating from that predictable position. The first thing that happens is the disruption of the pattern's autopilot. The pattern runs on autopilot because the conditions that allow it to run are reliably present. When those conditions change, when the reliable background of your predictable investment becomes genuinely uncertain, the autopilot disengages. The avoidant cannot continue running the pattern automatically, because the pattern's automatic operation assumes conditions that no longer reliably exist. This disengagement is not comfortable. The autopilot provided a specific form of ease, the ease of a dynamic that did not require genuine engagement because the other person's engagement was always sufficient to sustain it. The ease of managed distance in the knowledge that the connection would hold across the distance because the other person was holding it. That ease is no longer available when you stop being the person who holds it. What replaces the ease is the requirement of genuine engagement. The requirement that the avoidant actually show up for the dynamic rather than managing it from the comfortable distance that your reliable investment was making possible. And genuine engagement, actually showing up, actually being present, actually investing in the continuation of something that requires mutual investment to continue, is precisely the thing the avoidance pattern was designed to avoid. The second thing that happens is what might be called a confrontation with the actual situation. The avoidant, who has been relating to a version of the dynamic that was cushioned by your predictable investment, now relates to the dynamic without that cushion. And the dynamic without the cushion is more honestly itself than it was with it. What it is, honestly, is a connection between two people that is significant and real, and that requires both people to choose it actively for it to be what it could be. Not a connection that is sustained by one person's investment while the other manages the connection from a distance. A connection that requires genuine, mutual, daily choosing. The confrontation with this actual situation is the confrontation with the choice the avoidant has been successfully avoiding. Not a dramatic, announced, this is the moment choice. The ordinary, recurring, daily choice of whether to actually show up for something that matters rather than managing it at the level the defensive architecture prefers. When the cushion of your predictable investment is no longer available to absorb the consequences of not making that choice. When the choosing or not choosing of genuine engagement is visible in its actual effects, rather than being buffered by your continued availability, the choice becomes undeniable in a way it previously was not. The third thing that happens, for avoidants for whom the connection was genuinely significant, is the activation of something that the pattern was always suppressing, the genuine wanting. The specific, real, not managed away desire for the actual person rather than the managed version of the connection. When the conditions that allowed the pattern to avoid confronting the genuine wanting are removed, when the comfortable, cushioned, managed distance is no longer available because the other person is no longer reliably holding the connection across it, the wanting has nowhere to go except into honest awareness. And genuine wanting, honestly aware of itself, is motivating in a way that managed, suppressed, carefully maintained at a comfortable level desire is not. It produces the impulse to actually close the distance rather than manage it. To actually engage rather than to perform engagement while maintaining the defended interior position. To actually choose the connection actively and without the cushion of the other person's predictable investment doing the choosing for both of them. This is what people describe when they describe an avoidant finally stopping the games and engaging genuinely. It is not the avoidant having a sudden transformation of character. It is the avoidant encountering, for the first time in the dynamic, the conditions under which genuine engagement is required rather than optional. Under which the genuine wanting can no longer be satisfied by the managed version of the connection because the managed version is no longer available. Under which the choice is between genuine showing up or genuine loss. And the genuine loss, confronted honestly without the buffer of your predictable investment, is often more activating than anything the dynamic previously offered. Because it is real. Because it is not the temporary managed distance of someone who is still reliably there. Because it is the actual, undeniable, genuinely uncertain possibility that the connection ends. Now, the genuinely important question. The one that is more important than understanding what your genuine self-reclamation does to the avoidance pattern. Does this mean the avoidant will definitely stop the games and engage genuinely? Does the removal of your predictable investment guarantee the authentic showing up that the dynamic was always requiring? No, it does not guarantee it. And being honest about this is essential rather than optional. Some avoidants, when the conditions that allowed the pattern to run are removed, do make the choice. Do confront the genuine wanting and follow it toward genuine engagement. Do stop the automatic pattern because the automatic pattern no longer has the conditions it requires and the genuine alternative, actual, mutual, chosen connection becomes more available than the managed version. These avoidants exist. Genuine change happens. The dynamic becomes something different. Other avoidants, when the conditions are removed, find the alternative path, the path of not choosing the genuine engagement. Of accepting the genuine loss rather than doing what genuine engagement requires, of moving toward a different connection where the comfortable cushioned managed distance can be reinstated because the other person's predictable investment will again provide the foundation the pattern requires. These outcomes are not in your control. The removal of your predictable investment is not a guaranteed technique for producing a specific result in the avoidant. It is the honest, self-directed, genuine expression of someone who has decided that their own life and their own worth require the reorientation towards something real. The result it produces in the avoidant is the avoidant's responsibility, not yours. What is yours is the quality of what you bring to any genuine engagement, if it becomes available. The specific standards that the whole arc of this experience established. The clear, unhurried, self-possessed knowledge of what adequate love looks like and what the minimum conditions for a real relationship are. If the avoidant stops the games and engages genuinely, if the genuine wanting produces genuine showing up, genuine presence, genuine willingness to be in the connection at the level the connection requires, you will be in the position of someone assessing that engagement from the clearest available position. Not from hope, not from relief that the games have finally stopped. From the honest, accurate, standards-maintaining position of someone who knows the difference between genuine change and urgency-driven activation, who can receive the genuine engagement without immediately converting it into evidence that everything is now different, who requires the behavioral evidence over ordinary time that distinguishes real from managed. That position, clear, standard-maintaining, genuinely open but not prematurely certain, is the position that this entire arc has been building. The position of someone who stopped being available for the pattern, not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring more about the real thing than about the continuation of the managed version. Here is the summary of what actually stops avoidant games, stated plainly and without the management of its simplicity into something more complicated than it is. You become genuinely invested in your own life, not as a performance of investment designed to produce a reaction. Actually invested, actually interested, actually present in your own experience in a way that is more compelling to you than the monitoring of the avoidance patterns. You stop filling the gaps the pattern creates. Not strategically, because the gaps no longer feel to you like your responsibility to fill. Because the connection's continuation is no longer something you are willing to sustain unilaterally. You maintain honest standards, not rigidly, not with the punishing quality of someone who is withholding as punishment, with the quiet, solid, entirely genuine quality of someone who knows what they need and will not accept less as a permanent arrangement. You remain open, not to the pattern, to genuine engagement if it becomes available, to the real thing when and if the evidence suggests it is actually present rather than performed. These four things together, genuine investment in your own life, the cessation of gap filling, honest standards maintained, genuine openness to the real thing, are not a strategy. They are a description of someone who has arrived somewhere genuine through the honest work of everything this experience required. Someone who is no longer available for the managed version not because they decided to play a different game, but because they genuinely no longer want to play any game at all. That person, genuinely arrived at that position, not performing it, is the thing that stops avoidant games more reliably than any technique. Not because it is clever, because it is real. And real things, meeting the automatic pattern of managed distance, produce a confrontation that the pattern cannot navigate through its ordinary means. The genuine you, fully present in your own life, requiring genuine mutuality rather than absorbing managed distance, that is what changes things. Not the technique of appearing that way. The reality of being that way, and the reality, built through everything this experience produced, is available to you now, not as something to deploy. As something to inhabit, completely. Inhabiting the reality of genuine self-possession is not a single arrival. It is a practice, and the practice has ordinary days in it that do not feel like transformation and do not produce the specific, emotionally resonant quality of breakthrough that makes for compelling narrative. Most of the days are simply days. Days in which the work of being genuinely invested in your own life is not dramatic or particularly visible, but is happening nonetheless, in the specific, undramatic, accumulating way that real things always happen. This matters to say directly because the conversation about stopping avoidant games can inadvertently create an expectation of the cinematic version. The version in which the genuine shift produces an immediate, clear, emotionally satisfying response from the avoidant. In which the games stop visibly and the authentic engagement arrives unmistakably and the dynamic transforms in ways that are legible and confirming, and worth the cost of everything that preceded them. Sometimes that happens. Often it does not happen that cleanly. Often what happens is quieter and more ambiguous, and requires the same honest, patient, clear-eyed assessment that the rest of the experience has required. The avoidant may respond to the genuine shift with a gradual, incremental, imperfect increase in authentic engagement that is visible only over time, rather than in a single transformed interaction. Or they may respond with an initial increase in urgency that looks like authentic engagement and requires the careful behavioral evidence over time assessment to distinguish from managed return. Or they may not respond at all in the direction of genuine engagement, and the shift you made produces not the transformation of the dynamic, but the honest conclusion of it. All of these outcomes are possible. And the genuine self-possession that this conversation has been describing is the position from which all of them are navigable. Not painlessly, but from a place of sufficient internal ground that the navigation does not require the dismantling of everything you built to accomplish it. There is a specific aspect of stopping avoidant games that tends to receive less attention than it deserves, and it is the aspect that is most relevant to the daily practical experience of actually inhabiting the genuine shift rather than performing it. It is the management of your own nervous system during the transition. The transition from predictable investment to genuine self-possession is not a switch that flips. It is a process, and during the process, the nervous system is doing something specific that is worth understanding rather than simply trying to override. The nervous system was calibrated to the dynamic, to its rhythms, to its specific recurring patterns of activation and relief. The withdrawal produced anxiety, and the return produced relief, and the cycle of the two, repeated over time, became the baseline of what relational experience felt like. The nervous system learned the dynamic, encoded it, began to anticipate it in the automatic, below-conscious way that nervous systems anticipate familiar patterns. When the genuine shift occurs, when you stop organizing yourself around the dynamics patterns, the nervous system does not immediately update. It continues, for a period, to run the old calibration, to produce the anxiety when the silence extends, to reach toward the familiar cycle even when you have consciously decided you are no longer available for it, to generate the pull toward filling the gap or softening the boundary or returning to the familiar configuration because the familiar configuration, however insufficient, is at least known. This is not weakness. This is the nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do, running familiar patterns because familiar patterns are efficient, and because the updating of well-established patterns requires repetition of the new experience, rather than simply the decision to have the new experience. The practical implication is that the genuine shift requires tolerance of the nervous system's transition period, tolerance of the anxiety that arises when you do not fill the gap, tolerance of the pull toward the familiar configuration that arises when the silence extends, tolerance of the specific discomfort of sitting with the uncertainty of the genuine shift without resolving it prematurely into either the return to the familiar pattern or the dramatic declaration of permanent departure. The tolerance is not comfortable. It is the specific, necessary, entirely temporary discomfort of the nervous system updating, of the calibration shifting from the dynamics patterns to the new baseline of genuine self-possession. And it passes. Not immediately. Gradually, through the accumulated experience of surviving the anxiety without acting on it, and finding on the other side that the survival was genuine, and the ground held and the discomfort was finite rather than permanent, the updating of the nervous system's calibration is one of the most practically important and least discussed aspects of what actually happens when someone genuinely stops being available for avoidant patterns. Because most guidance focuses on the cognitive and strategic dimensions, understanding the psychology, making the right choices, maintaining the right standards. These things matter. And they are incomplete without the acknowledgement that genuine change is also a somatic process, a bodily process, a process that occurs in the nervous system and the physiology and the specific below-conscious calibration systems that govern how relational experience is processed. The body has its own memory of the dynamic, its own encoding of the familiar patterns, its own contribution to the pull toward the old configuration. And honoring the body's transition, giving it time, tolerating its discomfort, not requiring it to update faster than genuine updating actually occurs, is part of what makes the shift real rather than performed. The performed shift tries to override the body, tries to produce the behavioral markers of genuine self-possession, while the nervous system is still running the old calibration. And the body's continued running of the old calibration shows, in the specific, slightly strained quality of someone who is working to maintain a position rather than simply inhabiting it, in the monitoring of the avoidance response that continues underneath the performance of not monitoring, in the relief when the gap is filled that reveals the anxiety that the not filling was producing. The genuine shift allows the body's transition, tolerates the discomfort, does not require the immediate absence of the pull toward the familiar, simply does not act on the pull while the nervous system is updating. And in the not acting, the updating occurs. The calibration shifts. The pull toward the familiar becomes gradually less insistent. The anxiety when the gap is not filled becomes gradually less acute. The new baseline becomes gradually more available as the natural operating position rather than the effortful maintained one. There is something worth saying about what happens to your retraction and your genuine feeling for the avoidant during this process. Because one of the fears that attends the genuine shift is the fear of losing the feeling entirely. of the self-reclamation producing not just the cessation of the pattern, but the eventual dissolution of the genuine love and the genuine appreciation for what the connection contained. At its best, this fear is understandable, and it is, in most cases, unfounded. The genuine feeling does not dissolve when you stop being available for the pattern that was damaging you. It changes. It shifts from the activated, urgency-driven, anxiety-mixed quality that the pattern produces into something quieter and more honest. Into the specific, unactivated, genuinely felt appreciation of someone who loves without the urgency of not knowing whether the love is returned, without the anxiety of potential loss, without the specific, chronic, pattern-produced activation that was making the feeling feel bigger than it perhaps was and more essential than the honest assessment supported. The quieter version of the feeling is more accurate, not diminished, clarified. It is what the feeling looks like when it is not being amplified by the intermittent reinforcement of the pattern, when it is not being mixed with the relief that follows anxiety and the longing that follows withdrawal, and the specific, powerful, neurologically driven amplification that the pattern was producing. If the feeling survives the clarification, if it remains present and genuine and specific to the person rather than to the pattern, that is meaningful information. It suggests the feeling was real rather than primarily a product of the pattern's activation. That the connection contains something genuine rather than primarily the manufactured intensity of managed distance and intermittent warmth. If the feeling does not survive the clarification, if the quieter, unactivated version reveals that most of what felt like genuine love was the pattern's activation rather than the authentic response to the specific person, that is also meaningful information. Difficult information, but honest and important and ultimately more useful than the continuation of the activated feeling indefinitely. Either way, the clarification is valuable. The honest feeling, whatever it turns out to be when the pattern's amplification is removed, is more trustworthy than the activated version. And the trustworthy feeling, whatever its content, is a better foundation for any genuine decision than the amplified one. The stopping of avoidant games through genuine self-possession also changes something specific about the quality of any engagement that follows, whether with the avoidant who prompted the shift or in subsequent connections with other people. It changes the quality of what you bring to the dynamic, and therefore the quality of what the dynamic is capable of producing. The person who was available for the pattern, who was filling the gaps and absorbing the distance, and responding to each move with the predictable investment that the pattern required, was bringing a specific quality to the dynamic, a quality of anxious generosity, of generous giving from a slightly anxious place, of love that was genuine and was also mixed with the specific, chronic, low-level anxiety of someone whose relational security depended on the maintenance of the connection at the level of the other person's availability. The person who has done the genuine shift brings something different, a quality of grounded generosity, of genuine giving from a stable place, of love that is not mixed with the anxiety of dependency. That is offered from fullness rather than from the relief of having managed to sustain something that felt perpetually at risk. This quality is different in ways that are felt by the people on the receiving end of it. The grounded generosity does not have the specific, slightly pleading undertone of anxious generosity. It does not carry the weight of need that anxious generosity always carries, however graciously. It is simply offered, without the undertow, without the implicit request for the specific reciprocation that would relieve the anxiety. And the avoidant, whose defensive architecture is calibrated to the detection of emotional need pressing toward them, whose withdrawal was partly a response to the specific weight of the anxiety underneath the generosity, encounters the grounded version differently. There is less to withdraw from, less pressing need to manage at a comfortable distance, less of the specific activating quality that the anxious generosity was producing. What replaces the activation is something that the defensive architecture has less of an established response to. Something closer to simple, present, undemanding warmth. Warmth that is genuine and not anxious and not pressing toward any particular response. Warmth that is available but not insistent, present but not organized around the other person's reaction. This quality of presence is genuinely disarming to avoidant defenses in ways that the anxious generosity, however loving, was not. Not because it is strategically calibrated to disarm, because it genuinely does not require the defense. The defense was built against need pressing toward it. Warmth that is not pressing does not trigger the mechanism the defense was built to manage. The practical experience of bringing this grounded quality to a dynamic with an avoidant, once the genuine shift has occurred and the nervous system has updated and the new baseline is genuinely inhabited rather than performed, tends to produce something specific in the texture of the interactions. The interactions feel easier. Not in the shallow sense of less conflicted, in the specific, genuine sense of less charged, less organized around the management of the distance, less oriented toward any particular outcome, less weighted by the anxiety that the previous configuration was always producing. And in the ease, the specific, genuine, not manufactured ease of two people engaging without the pattern's oxygen present, something becomes available that the pattern was always preventing: simple, honest, mutually present exchange. The specific quality of two people who are both actually there, not managing the dynamic from their respective positions, actually present with each other in the particular, ordinary, genuinely connecting way that the pattern was always disrupting. This does not mean the avoidance defensive architecture has dissolved. It has not dissolved, it will not dissolve, because the dynamic has changed. The architecture is deep and old and yields only to sustained, dedicated personal work on the avoidant's own part. But in the ease, in the specific, temporary, unguarded moments that the grounded quality of your presence creates, the architecture relaxes slightly. The vigilance reduces, the distance managed reduces, and in the reduction, something more honest becomes briefly, imperfectly, genuinely available. Whether the avoidance stays in that more honest place or retreats from it back to the managed position is theirs to determine. What you brought was the conditions under which the more honest place became available. The inhabiting of it is their work. There are specific things that people do in the process of attempting this genuine shift that undermine it before it has a chance to become real. Naming them clearly is practically useful, because they are common and because they tend to occur in the specific transition period when the nervous system is still running the old calibration and the genuine shift is not yet fully inhabited. The first is checking for the avoidance response to the shift, monitoring, directly or indirectly, how the genuine self-possession is landing, adjusting the level of the shift based on the avoidance apparent response, pulling back from the shift if the response seems insufficient and deepening it if the response seems to be moving in the desired direction. This monitoring and adjusting is the anxious generosity in its most recent form. It is still organized around the avoidance response as the primary variable. It is still the predictable investment wearing different clothes. The second is performing the shift with an audience in mind. Doing the things that genuine self-possession does, being less available, less responsive, more invested in independent life, with the specific quality of someone who is aware that these things are being observed and is calibrating the performance to the observed. The performance has the specific quality of demonstration, of showing rather than simply being, and the showing, however skillfully executed, is still organized around the avoidance perception of it rather than around the genuine internal experience of someone who is simply living their life. The third is using the shift as leverage, treating the genuine self-possession as a tool for producing a specific response rather than as an honest expression of where you actually are. This is the most common and the most undermining misuse of everything this conversation has been describing. The moment the genuine shift becomes a tactic, it stops being genuine. And the moment it stops being genuine, it stops producing the effect that only the genuine version produces. These three undermining behaviors are not moral failures. They are the understandable, predictable expressions of someone who has understood the principle of genuine self-possession but has not yet fully arrived at it, who is in the transition period, who is working toward the genuine version while the nervous system is still running some of the old calibration. They are signs of the process being in progress rather than complete. The response to noticing them is not self-criticism, it is the patient, gentle, specific redirecting back towards the genuine interior. Back toward the honest question of what you actually need and what you actually feel and what your life actually looks like when it is genuinely organized around its own genuine content, rather than around the monitoring of the dynamic. That redirecting, repeated as many times as necessary, is the work, not the grand, single, dramatic shift, the daily, specific, patient redirecting back toward the genuine. The genuine version, when it is fully inhabited, does not require monitoring, does not require the assessment of its own effectiveness, does not require the audience of the avoidance response to confirm its rightness. It simply is. The specific, quiet, entirely self-sufficient quality of someone who is genuinely present in their own life and genuinely invested in their own becoming, and genuinely open to real connection if it becomes available and genuinely not available for managed distance, dressed as connection. That quality, self-sufficient in the real sense, not the avoidance defended self-sufficiency, that is actually the management of need rather than its genuine absence, but the genuine self-sufficiency of someone who is actually whole, is the thing the avoidant has no game for, has no managed response to, has no adequate countermove against, because it is not a move, it is a person. And persons who are genuinely whole, who are genuinely present in their own lives, genuinely invested in their own becoming, genuinely not organizing their sense of self around the avoidance engagement with them, do not play games. Do not require the avoidant to stop playing games as a precondition for their own wholeness. Do not hold their completion pending the avoidant's authentic showing up. They are already complete. The wholeness is not contingent. The life is already happening. The engagement with the avoidant, if it becomes genuine and mutual and worth the investment, is an addition to something already full, rather than the filling of something empty. That is what stops avoidant games, not because it is designed to stop them, because genuine wholeness meeting managed distance is a specific and honest confrontation that managed distance cannot navigate through its usual means. The tools were built for a different kind of presence, for the anxious generosity, for the predictable investment, for the person who needs the connection to be sustained by their own effort. Not for this, not for the person who is already full, who offers real connection from genuine fullness, who does not need the game to sustain anything, because what they are sustaining was never dependent on the game. That person is who you have been building toward, through everything this experience required. Through the clarity and the self-knowledge and the restored perception and the accurate baseline and the detachment and the complete reorientation and the daily unglamorous, genuine choosing of yourself. That person is available to you now, not as an achievement to be reached, as a practice to be inhabited, daily, imperfectly, genuinely, without the game, without the monitoring, without the anxious generosity that was always, underneath its genuine love, a form of asking, simply present, simply whole. Simply the most honest version of yourself offered to the world and to whatever genuine connection the world contains, without the requirement that any particular person receive it in any particular way in order for the offering to have been worth making. That is the end of the games. Not theirs, yours. The moment you genuinely stop playing, the game has no players, and what remains, if anything remains, is the only thing that was ever worth having, the real thing. Between two people who are both actually there,